Chapter 9. Samantha scowled at her reflection as her maids dressed her for a private dinner with her father and Uncle Cadman. Things had been tense with her father since she refused to name a consort, and her success with the Masonians hadn't changed that. Knowing her father and the Duke were going to gang up on her, she dreaded the dinner. She heard a knock on her outer door and prayed it would be someone giving her an excuse to avoid the dinner. Ardra answered the knock and informed her Father Flannellan, the high priest's assistant, was asking to see her. When the priest entered, he bowed, but only very slightly. "Your Highness, His Excellency the High Priest Shyla, bids you wait upon him in his chambers this evening, at half after the hour of 7. "Yes, I can go there instead of the dinner." She'd opened her mouth to agree when it hit her just how grossly she was being insulted. Only someone above her in status could summons her. That Sulis cursed bastard! Who in the 7th house does he think he is? "I'm sure you misspoke. You meant to say His Excellency requests an audience with me. You may tell him he may have one at 10 tomorrow morning." Father Flannellan took a step backwards. "But, Your Highness, His Excellency wishes to speak to you this evening." The princess kept her voice steady and cold. "We all wish a great number of things we cannot have." She turned from the priest. He stammered briefly and then laughed. "Can you believe the audacity of the man?" Without giving her maids a chance to finish with her hair, Samantha hurried to her father's chambers. She burst into the king's private dining room. "Do you know who just summons me? Some bastard of a priest sent by His Excellency himself." The king's eyes narrowed, one of the few signs of anger her father ever allowed himself to show. "I hope you had sense enough to refuse." "Of course." She folded her arms. Cadman shook his head. "Shyla is hungry for power. Truly, it doesn't surprise me he sees himself above the crown princess. Female inferiority is his most cherished and oft-preached doctrine. He is rabid in his denouncement of the Courtian priestesses." Samantha snorted. "As if a female goddess would create women to be inferior. The entire idea is absurd." Solar's eyes narrowed further. "I've heard he believes Sulis is Mel, and he has been constantly badgering me to give the church courts power beyond that of excommunication. I've gotten so tired of the old bag, I told Gilroy I wasn't available to him anymore." Samantha snorted again. "So he decides to command me? I'd like to strangle the presumptuous imbecile." Cadman laughed, but the king drew his eyebrows closer together. "Using such words to refer to the high priest is politically dangerous. However, he does need to be put in his place. You will do so tomorrow. Now sit down and we'll discuss the matter of your consort." "Haven't I been upset enough for one evening? What is there to discuss? I've told you my choice." She stomped from the room before either of the men could stop her. For her meeting with the high priest, Samantha chose a regal midnight blue dress embroidered in gold. She put a large chain of gold around her neck, and her maids dressed her hair in a way that emphasized the heir's golden circuit. 10 o'clock arrived, but the high priest did not. Does he think I have nothing to do all day but sit around and wait for his pleasure? Samantha was due at Town Hall at 11 to hear petitions from the commoners, a duty she performed weekly. She turned to her maids. "When His Excellency arrives, inform him one does not keep the heir to the throne waiting. If he has something he wishes to discuss with me, he can come to the city hall and place his name on the list with the others. With any luck, his turn will come up sometime next week or the week after that." Ardra giggled. "With pleasure, Your Highness. But perhaps you should have a clean-up crew on hand. He'll be so angry he'll probably explode, and I don't want to clean blood and brains out of the carpet." Samantha returned to the palace in the late afternoon. Unsurprisingly, Shyla hadn't joined the line of petitioners at City Hall. She was glad, because she'd barely held it together when one of the petitioners had erupted in a sickly purple. Evidence and testimonies from the witnesses contradicted each other widely, but the putrid nature of the purple told her immediately who was lying. Holy Sulis, what does it mean? Does madness reveal truth? But if I'm not mad, why do I see these things? When she got back to the palace, Darhauer reminded her about the bout he'd arranged for potential members of her personal guard. When they entered the palace arena, the 12 men assembled all bowed deeply to her. "I have judged each of these men suitable for your personal guard," Darhauer said, "and all have expressed an eagerness to serve in this capacity. I believe 4 should be chosen for now. We can add others later if we deem it necessary." Samantha nodded, knowing she was in no condition to make a judgment and wishing she just told Darhauer to do the choosing. Darhauer had the men paired off against each other. She and Darhauer stood to the side, and Darhauer commented on the abilities of the different men. He pointed to the first couple. "I wouldn't judge Birak simply by his sword work. He is good with a sword, but most importantly, he's the best archer in the guard." Samantha had always liked Birak. He blurted out whatever he thought, while most of the guard hardly dared say a word in her presence. "Phelan is mute, but he'd take on an entire army to protect you." Phelan had always reminded her of a big dog. Those odd yellow eyes of his promised complete devotion whenever he looked at her. Birak noticed her watching and winked conspiratorially. Phelan took advantage of the moment's inattention to land a blow to his ribcage. Birak swore loudly and then blushed as he realized she'd heard him. He didn't bother to apologize, though, but focused his attention on beating Phelan back. "Albie is better than Conroy," Darhauer pointed towards the next pair. "But Conroy is better than most, and he's rock solid steady. He'll keep his head in a crisis." She nodded and glanced at the next pair. "Bryce is fast," Darhauer said. Indeed, his sword was nothing more than a blur. And Sadon... Samantha didn't hear what else Darhauer said, because at that moment 4 of the guards burst into color, glowing with the same light blue and white she'd earlier seen on Kaelin. "No!" she screamed. The entire room went still. Darhauer and Kaelin drew their swords intent for battle. But her madness wasn't something they could protect her from. She ran from the arena with Darhauer and Kaelin in pursuit. The princess fled to her rooms without answering her guards' questions. She slammed the doors and yelled at them to leave her alone. "I'm mad! 4 at once! It's getting worse! What am I going to do?" Samantha collapsed next to her bed and wrapped her arms around herself to stop from shaking. She looked up at the Princess Danyue. "How can I be mad? My father needs an heir!" Danyue's expression seemed to mock her, and she knew she could hide from the problem no longer. She absolutely had to figure out what was causing the colors. But since she didn't dare ask anyone, she'd have to do the research herself. She dried her eyes, washed her face, and stuffed all her turmoil behind a court mask. When she opened the door to her corridors, Darhauer looked at her with evident distress. She looked away from him and without a word headed to the library. As they bowed to her, Samantha felt as if every member of the library staff was seeing her madness. One of them knocked over an ink bottle in his haste to rise, and when she looked at him, he turned a bright red. She tried to keep her voice casual when she addressed Druce, the chief librarian. "I have heard some rumors about my family's history I'd like to verify. It would be better done in private." "Of course, Your Highness." Druce gestured to the rest of the library staff. "You heard Her Highness. Everybody out." The library staff disappeared. She turned to her bodyguards. "Now back up, the 2 of you," she said. "Your Highness, we cannot leave you alone," Darhauer protested. She glared. "You both can and will. You can't possibly think Druce is a threat." Darhauer glared at Druce, sizing the man up. To her intense irritation, Kaelin looked to Darhauer, and only when Darhauer nodded did he move away. She kept waving them farther back until they were out of earshot. Then she gestured Druce into a seat at a nearby table and sat near him. Samantha kept her voice low. "I've heard rumors that Princess Danyue might have been insane." Druce chuckled. "You can rest assured the rumor is false, Your Highness. The historical record gives no evidence of insanity." "The rumor stated Danyue would see colors explode in the air around people." "Colors, Your Highness?" The librarian briefly wrinkled his brow, but quickly smiled as his eyes lit up. "You mean auras, I believe, Your Highness. The projection of a person's essence into the air surrounding them, which manifests itself as a pattern of colors and reveals a person's character." "Yes, that's it!" Samantha wanted to laugh out loud. There was a name for what she saw. Druce chuckled again. "I assure Your Highness, Danyue was no aurora. That's the name we use for a woman who sees auras. Whoever spread this rumor had no respect for the princess. It's tantamount to calling her a bastard." Samantha's relief withered. "Whatever do you mean?" Druce chuckled yet again, and Samantha swore she'd ram her fist through his mouth and out the back of his head if he did it one more time. "Your Highness, auroras only arise from the mixture of noble and common blood. Since the nobility of Danyue's mother is not in doubt, Danyue could only be an aurora if her mother had been welcoming someone other than her husband into her bed." The room spun, and Samantha feared she would faint. "No, that can't be true." "Are you all right, Your Highness? You've gone white." "I'm fine." Samantha tried to smile and hoped it didn't look as false as it felt. She breathed deeply and reminded herself who she was talking to. Her tutor had called Druce a muddle-headed imbecile. "I'd like to read more about Danu. I'm sure she must appear in some of these books." She gestured towards the nearest set of shelves. The palace library was huge. The walls were lined with bookcases that reached from the floor to at least 10 feet above her head. More bookcases, nearly as tall, stood row upon row in the center of the room. A staircase led up to the second floor, which was lined with more books. When Druce chuckled, Samantha barely restrained the urge to pummel him. "Danu has always held a fascination for the historian. She's said to be a powerful sorceress, although I'm sure the frog story is apocryphal. To my knowledge, no one has written a book exclusively about Danu, but many histories devote entire chapters to her. A rare thing for someone who wasn't a reigning monarch. Shall we assemble our holdings on Princess Danu?" Samantha nodded. "Please do, and while you're at it, I'd like to see whatever you have about auroras. I've never heard of one before." "I'm not surprised, Your Highness. It is an extremely rare ability. There hasn't been an aurora in Corflendi in at least a century." Druce bowed and left to fetch the books. Druce brought her books with references to Danu first. To make her interest in Danu seem legitimate, she opened a book on the history of Lundian royalty and moved her eyes over the page. But she didn't have the slightest idea what it said, or even if the portion of the book she opened it to had anything to do with Danu. If he's right, if I'm a bastard... No, it's not possible. Druce is never right. He catalogs books beginning with the nationality of the author. When Druce delivered the first book on magic, Samantha had to breathe slowly and deeply to stop herself from pouncing on it. She kept her eyes on the history book and continued to turn pages at regular intervals until Druce placed the last book on the table in front of her. "There you are, Your Highness. 10 books on Danu, and 10 for magic. Is there any other assistance I can provide? If you tell me the exact information you're looking for, I'd be more than happy to do the research for you." "I want to know if these colors mean I'm a bastard. Should I have you research that?" "No, I'll do it myself." Her voice came out far colder than she'd intended. Right now, anger was her only defense against falling apart. "Well, then I guess I'll leave you to it, Your Highness. I'll be in my office if you require further assistance." Druce spoke politely, but Samantha could tell he was offended. When the door closed behind Druce, Samantha slammed the book on Danu shut and reached for the first volume on magic, Magical Abilities and Their Origins, by Father Druin. To her intense frustration, Father Druin hadn't provided an index for his immense work, so it took her some time to find the section on auroras. She decided her first order of business as monarch would be to hang writers who didn't index their books. Finally, she found the pages she sought and read silently. "An aurora is a person of the female sex, gifted by our high and holy goddess Sulis, may her name be praised forever, with a capacity to see the very currents of the air that vibrate from our corporeal being as we reposition ourselves through the space of this world, and as we inhale and exhale the substance of life. Our high and holy goddess Sulis, may her name be praised forever, has seen fit in her infinite wisdom and continuous care of us her children, who despite our defects and blemishes which make us forever unworthy of her attention..." "Get to the point, you daft old man. If you aren't already dead, I'll see you hanged for such abominable prose." She struggled through Father Druin's nearly incomprehensible explanation of an aurora's powers. He claimed the onset of Aurora's power came when a girl began to bleed in the way of a woman. Samantha paused. She hadn't made the connection before, but she'd just begun to bleed the day before she first saw Darhauer's aura. The book further claimed a mature aurora could call forth a person's aura at will. This maturity came when an aurora bore a child. Before an aurora's maturity, auras would simply appear at seemingly random intervals. However, 2 things made the appearance of an aura more likely: blood ties and necessity. It was almost always the auras of family members an aurora saw first. And the more an aurora needed to know a person's character, the more likely an aura would be visible. Finally, towards the end of the section, the princess found the passage she was looking for. "As with all gifts of a magical nature, our high and holy goddess Sulis, may her name be praised forever, has seen fit in her infinite wisdom to bestow this gift only upon those whose life fluid has been adulterated." when the blood of one from the far and frozen Northlands intermingles itself with the blood of one from our fair southern climes, and when in the additional part, if one or the other of the adulterating pair possesses the blood of a most lofty and exalted nature, which debases itself by mingling with the blood of the lowest and most ignoble variety, our high and holy goddess Sulis, may her name be praised forever, will, as it pleases her in her infinite mercy, bless the offspring of the debased union, if the results are a child of the female gender, with the gift of the perception of auras. Samantha slammed the book shut. Lies! It isn't true. How can I trust someone who writes such nonsense as if one or other of the adulterating pair? Besides, old Father Druin, may he rot in the seven hells, was a priest. Priests can't be trusted on anything about magic, since they're mostly responsible for its disappearance because of their purity of blood nonsense. Samantha shoved Druin's book aside and picked up the next volume, which was clearly newer and wasn't written by a priest, but by a man named Forsa Duffstout. She could tell at once that Forsam knew more than old Father Druin. Forsa had provided an index. It took her only a few moments to find the right pages. The first words on the page further convinced her of Forsa's great intelligence. They were written in clear, simple Corflandian. Samantha skimmed the page to the section that described the origins of an aurora's power. While certain aspects of the mixture necessary to produce an aurora have long been the subject of debate among scholars, the one universally agreed upon fact is that it must come from a mixture of noble and common blood. Idiot! The princess slammed a volume down. Who cared if Forsa could write an index? He obviously knew more than Father Druin, universally agreed upon. Scholars can't universally agree that the sun will come up in the east tomorrow. Then it hit her. They are both men. If all auroras are female, what can men know about them? Samantha searched the volumes for one written by a woman. She found two. The first was written by Mother Etten, a priestess and aurora in the service of Sulis, who was also the illegitimate child of Rinfred, the Count of Borchet, and his chamber servant. That description made the princess nervous. Mother Etten was a bastard. Of course she'd say that being a bastard was necessary for one to be an aurora. Not surprisingly, Mother Etten made the same foolish claim as the two men. The second volume was by the Countess of Fatchlandia, but she was no better. Samantha was desperate. 4 out of the 10 volumes had now said the same thing. She sank her head in her hands. Then another idea dawned on her. Maybe she wasn't really an aurora after all. Maybe the colors she saw were a completely different kind of colors. She ignored the fact that Father Druin's description of an aurora fit her so well. She hadn't really read the description of the aurora's talents in the other books. Eager to prove herself not an aurora, she went back to Forsa Duffsum's Magic of the Joined Kingdoms. But it was no use. Forsa described what she'd experienced all too well, as did Mother Etten and the Countess of Fatlandia. This is impossible. The king is my father. He loves me. Hours later, Samantha put down the last volume. She had no doubts. Although the books disagreed on some minor aspects of an aurora's power, it was universally agreed upon that she was a bastard. That was much, much worse than being mad. Her mother was little better than a whore, and she wasn't the heir. She was a fraud, an impostor, some foundling foisted upon the king without his knowledge. She wanted to scream, tear the books to pieces, and dissolve into a flood of tears, but she was too devastated even to move. My poor father! This would kill him! She didn't know how many times Solar had told her of his long wait for an heir. He'd insisted if he had died without one, competing claimants would tear Corflandia apart. My father worked his entire life to prevent this, and I have failed him. Who knows how many thousands will die because of me? As she lifted her head and looked out into the blackness of the night, a new thought occurred to her. Does he know? Would he have taken another man's child as his own if that was the price of preserving the peace? Samantha knew he wouldn't have hesitated. The joined kingdoms were far too important to him. Could a 15-year-old girl truly have carried out an affair without his knowledge? Samantha put her head back in her hands. She didn't know what to do. If her father did know, he'd be angry she found out. If he didn't know, what would it do to him? He was nearly 90. There was no chance of him having another heir. She needed advice, but could think of no one she dared turn to. Is it okay to be a fraud if it is the only way to avoid civil war? Does the good of the people demand I continue to live a lie? Holy Mother, what do you want me to do? I'm not certain I can live with either choice. The stillness of the night brought no answer, but the consequences were too great for her to make the decision rationally. The books were right about one thing. Earlier today, her need had made her ability operate. She certainly needed men loyal to her. She picked up a quill and dipped it in ink. On a sheet of paper she wrote the names of the 4 men whose oars she'd seen: Phelan, Bryce, Birack, and Conroy. She called Darhower and handed him the paper. "Add these to my guard." These men, like Caelan and Darhower, would loyally serve a bastard. She wished she knew if she were damning herself by allowing them to do so.